in spirit and prayer.
So welcome, everyone. My name is Greg Rupik. I'm a contributing editor for the journal With One Accord. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sister Sandra M. Schneiders of the Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Monroe, Michigan. Sister Sandra is Professor Emerita of New Testament and Spirituality at the Jesuit School of Theology and the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. She is the author of 15 books, 79 chapters, and over 100 articles on scripture, Christian spirituality, feminism, and the prophetic in religious life. Welcome, Sandra. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, you were invited to study theology at a time in the Catholic Church when very few women did. Can you tell us a little bit about the decision that sent you to the Institut Catholique in Paris, your time in Rome, and your eventual tenure at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley?
Well, my going to study theology was actually the initiative of Sister Margaret Brennan, who was a very important figure in the sister formation movement and the whole renewal of religious life. And she was elected General Superior of my congregation in 1966. And one of the first things that she wanted to do, and she had, when I was in formation, she had taught my class theology and so on. So she had an idea of what my interests were. And she decided to send 5 of our members to different major centers of theological work. Her conviction was that we needed to have theologians within our own organizations, not bringing them in priests to tell us what our life was about. And so she selected 5 of us who had shown, I suppose, a deep interest in theology, and told us that we could go any place where we could get a doctorate in theology. Well, you couldn't do that. A woman couldn't do that in this country, but you could in Europe. The other 4 went to Louvain, partly because there was an English faculty in theology as well. I chose to go to Paris, and Paris had the first major institute for the study of Christian spirituality right to the doctoral level in the world at that time. So I was already bending towards spirituality and scripture. So I went to Paris. And that was in 1968. So I landed in Paris just as the whole city went up in flames with the student revolution. So that was my introduction to life in Europe. And so I did my licentiate, which is somewhere in between a master's degree and a doctoral degree in this country, as well as my languages, so learning French and German and so on. But I decided to go to Rome for the doctorate. And so at the end of the licentiate, I went to Rome because they had, at that point, the only doctoral level program in Christian spirituality of Catholic vintage at the Gregorian. So I was able to study scripture and spirituality there. So that's basically how I got into it.
And then, how long after you finished your studies in Rome did you move to Berkeley?
Well, I was actually hired by Berkeley before I defended my dissertation in Rome. I'm not sure. I never asked how they knew about me, but they flew me to Berkeley and interviewed me. And so I actually had the job before I defended the dissertation. So I went directly to Berkeley.
And you had mentioned in a previous conversation that we had had that there was a bit of an episode, I guess, around your getting tenure. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, I've heard of another episode. It's called World War II. um, uh, Actually, I was at that point the only woman on an all Jesuit faculty, and some of those gentlemen were. Well, actually, the Jesuit School of Theology was the the Jesuit scholasticate turned into a faculty of theology. So the only people in it were Jesuit scholastics preparing for ordination, and they had just begun to admit other kinds of students. They had moved out of the hills of Los Gatos, where the seminary was, to Berkeley, which was the center of the student revolution. It was into the Graduate Theological Union, where you had several denominations and several major world religions forming an academic entity. And I was the only woman on the faculty, on the Jesuit faculty, when in the normal course of events, well, a little early, I came up for tenure, for promotion and tenure. And there were there were people on the faculty who did not really want, they had no objection to my teaching there, but they really didn't want the permanent change that would take place if there were non-Jesuits on the faculty who basically could not be fired except for cause. So it was changing the whole notion of a Jesuit scholasticate for ordination candidates, with a few other people allowed to study there, to a school of theology, which is open to men and women, to people who are candidates for ordination and not candidates for ordination. But it also gave me voting rights and leverage that any Jesuit would have. So it
you
was
kind of cleared a hurdle that hadn't been cleared before, in a way.
well, and one of the things, I mean, the women of my generation who lived through this in sector after sector after sector, these are things you can't roll back. Up to that point, you could say we've never had a woman tenured. We've never had a woman full professor, and we're not going to start now. But once you've got one, that argument goes out the window.
So what other kinds of, because this is in a way an opening of that door, a passing of a threshold that had never been passed before, in your subsequent kind of long career teaching, writing, how have you seen the understanding of women's prophetic leadership in the church kind of evolve over the course of your career? Have you seen any kinds of subsequent changes or evolutions in the thought of women's leadership?
Oh, there's no question. It's the difference that we would have expected in previous years to take centuries. I mean, if you look at just at the Jesuit school, and the Jesuits are more open than a lot of groups. To go from an institution was entirely male, all the students, all the faculty, all either ordained or headed for ordination. I mean, this is 1% of 1% of 1%, to what it is now, where there's several women on the faculty. There are even, I think right now, there's someone who's not a Roman Catholic on the faculty. And they're teaching seminarians as well, who are going to school with people who are not seminarians, who are going into other kinds of ministries, who are women as well as men. And it was entering into a consortium that included not only non-Catholic Christians, but non-Christians. So the consortium included Buddhists, it included, so a real sea change was undergoing. And this is not the kind of thing that you can say, well, we tried it and it didn't work, we're going to go back to I mean, once these thresholds were passed, they were passed.
And did you see any similar kinds of changes occurring in the structures of the church, kind of a wider understanding throughout Catholic culture about the place of women in either leadership or in church structures?
Well, as we know, where they've drawn the line and are still holding it is with regard to ordination. And I have to say, from one standpoint, I'm not too sad about that, because it's much more likely that the ordained structure will slurp up the first women coming in than that those first women will change the structure. I was fortunate. I was the only woman at the Jesuit school. It actually did change the structures so that now they're more. But ordaining a woman here, ordaining a woman there, it's much more likely that she's going to be clericalized than that they're going to be run because of
Right.
the way the structure, it's very heavily in place. And it raises, this could be a whole other discussion, but it raises a whole other question about whether or not we want all the major ministers in the church ordained.
Right.
And what does that mean? And what does that say about the baptismal power for ministry of the baptized? If you can't really minister until you're ordained.
Right. So it speaks to a kind of an appreciation of the wider the diversity of gifts, I suppose, in the church.
Yeah, so the big question is, if someone is called to ministry, to deny them that ministry because of something like their skin color, their gender, their anything except their qualification for the ministry, is simply wrong. It's deleterious to the church, it's deleterious to ministry. That's the problem. Not that we want to say, well, you're not really a minister unless you're ordained. Like, I consider the ministry of theology to be every bit as influential in the church as being able to hear someone's confession. So these threshold issues, sometimes they're very important because you got to bring that barrier down. You've simply got to say, end of the affair, we're not going to do that anymore. But if they're substantive, then I think we have to ask, what's the substance? If I feel that I am not really a minister unless I'm ordained, we've got a real problem with me and a problem with the theology of ministry.
So speaking kind of a little bit more, I guess, specifically about a specific vocation within the church, religious life. Could you in the past have kind of described the vocation to religious life and its kind of prophetic dimension in a way that's analogous to the vocation of an artist. Can you expand on that analogy a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I have actually expanded on it quite a bit. The religious vocation is not a job. It's not a task in the church. It's a call to a person to that they personally experience as a call, that they personally experience as being called to a total exclusive self-donation to Jesus for the entirety of their life, to the exclusion of any other permanent life commitment. That's the way I would define religious life. And that's somewhat, I find a close analogy with an artist. When a little kid at the age of 5 is doing something that most kids don't do at the age of 5 with their pen, and someone, or with music, simply sits down at the age of 3 at the piano and begins to play, you say, we're in the presence of something that we don't set the parameters for. So what are we going to do with this child? Tell him, don't you dare touch that piano again until I give you permission. That's for adults. Or are you going to say, we better start planning about how we're going to send this kid to music school? So the call to religious life is like the call to being an artist or the call to other things where it's in the person. So I have brought out that analogy to say that religious are not simply defective priests, people who would be priests if they could, but they're not good enough because they're girls. That's not religious life is not priesthood light, or a substitute, a sop to the people who aren't qualified. This is a completely different vocation.
Right.
And someone could be called to both, but I think we have a fair amount of evidence in history that the attempt to combine both has not always been the best version of religious life, at least, and often not the best version of ordained ministry either.
Right.
But they're because of the fact that women were barred from priesthood, a lot of people think that women religious would be priests if they could, but they can't, so they go for number two. And what
Right.
I've been trying to say is, no, it's like saying the reason this kid doesn't want to go to vocational school is because his name is Chopin and history has another thing in mind for him.
Right.
And the fact that some people don't understand music doesn't change the fact that Chopin should play music and not go to vocational school.
Right.
So that's basically what I've been trying to do with that analogy, to say that that the religious vocation, it has shown up much more clearly among women than men because the male response to it has been so overshadowed, so that brothers became a kind of secondary, second level priesthood, and the women were a kind of out in the backyard. But that's starting with the priesthood and working your way down. I'm saying, no, we're talking about two vocations that do not imply each other.
Right.
Like when people have said to me, would you be ordained if you could? I say, absolutely not. Religious life is a full-time occupation. Vocation.
And does that does the kind of like uniqueness and peculiarity and in a way kind of the kind of the genius of the religious vocation, I mean it that seems to make it much more rare and in a way kind of worthy of treasure and respect. Does that have any implications for some of these arguments that you might hear about the kind of decline of religious life today and like the lesser numbers and the older communities?
Yes. No, that's a very insightful question. And I think a very important one. I personally do not think that it was ever the case that half or three-quarters of a senior graduating class were called to enter the convent and vow perpetual consecrated celibacy for the rest of their lives. But when you only had two possibilities, get married or go into the convent or be an old maid, because you couldn't be a priest, that structure distorted the whole notion of vocation. I personally, I would say the vocation to religious life is as rare as the vocation to being an artist.
Hmm.
Tons of kids take piano lessons, and many of them learn to play very well. There aren't too many Rachmaninoffs in most generations. And to talk of religious vocation as kind of analogously to a talent doesn't mean having a special ability of some sort. It's a call that some people have because of who they are, because of who God made them, that says, I recognize completely that any baptized Christian can and is called to do all the good in this world that they possibly could do. And some people say, you know what, I really don't want to do anything other than that. I really want to give all the attention of my heart, of my soul, of my mind to the pursuit of God, I've called it the God quest, the way an artist is on the beauty quest. And that doesn't mean that other people are not loving museums, loving art, loving beauty, but they're also doing other things which are, as far as we know, equally important. But there are some people who are fascinated with the God thing, and they decide to pursue it to the exclusion of any other primary life commitment. It's what a musician does. It's what a painter does. And it's not because the person is better or because they're more talented, it's simply what has been implanted in them, like the little kid who sits down and starts playing at the piano when other kids don't know what the keys are for.
So there's also kind of there's a bit of an element there too of yeah, kind of witness to this aspect of human experience, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly. That's that's a very good way of putting it. That when people witness with the whole of their life to one thing, it it's a there's a strength to that witness that you don't get when people are doing several things.
right.
And that has a clarity to it, I think, that whether people can explain it or not, I think people get it.
And do you think that that kind of that single-minded devotion to Christ itself has kind of been, I mean, so the call to consecrated kind of virginity is one aspect of that, but do you think that just that wholehearted commitment to Christ has also been kind of resonated with that the kind of biblical prophetic devotion to God in some way?
Yes, if I'm understanding your question correctly, um, I think that there's been some dimming of the witness of religious life as women religious went into various ministries of teaching, hospitals, and so on, and did such a good job of it, and alleviated so many problems and so on, that for a lot of people, what they see is a kind of workforce that's more effective because these women don't have kids and home and family and so on. So you can send dozens of them into the school or into the hospital. And I think that that's one of the things that the renewal after Vatican II did was make religious themselves ask themselves. I have to ask myself the question because I could do other things. After I could have left. I could have gotten a doctorate. I could have, could have made a lot of money. I could have gotten married. When you have to ask yourself that question, for example, if I did not have the opportunity to study, or if I got a terminal disease, or if would I still choose to be religious? Well, the only reason for that choice, and we probably don't all see this early in our career, but gradually, it's like a woman saying, you know what, this guy isn't nearly as handsome as I thought he was when I married him. And I don't like the way he brushes his teeth. And yeah, but she says, would you marry somebody else? And she says, never, never. And I think that's one of the contributions that all this hullabaloo that we've had, and there's been plenty of it. The Vatican has been on our case more than once. One of the things I think that has happened in this period is that people have had to hone in and ask that question. And when a lot of people left religious life, I don't think it was necessarily disillusionment and saying, well, the life is going down the tubes, I'm going to jump ship before it goes down. But being forced to ask the question, why am I doing this? When this man is sick in bed and I know he's going to die, why don't I divorce him and go someplace else?
Right.
and if somebody asks that question, say, not in a minute, never.
Right.
And an awful lot of women religious said that after Vatican II. The Vatican is after us, our schools are closing, we have fewer members and so on. Why don't I get out of this while the getting is good?
Right.
While I have options. And they said, wouldn't think of it.
Right.
Not for a minute.
Yeah. What a beautiful witness, I guess, to have that clarity of purpose at the end of the day.
Well, it's a gift to us, I think, that we've been forced to get to that kind of clarity.
Mhm.
When you didn't have any options, before the council, if somebody left religious life, they did it kind of in the middle of the night and quietly, and you tried not to get anybody's attention because they had failed, But when all the doors are wide open and there are no financial incentives or power incentives or any of the rest of it, and you look at it and you say, why am I here? I'm here because of him, and I wouldn't think of doing anything else.
That's a beautiful place to stop. I don't think that we can top that. So, Sister Sandra, thank you so much. It was wonderful to speak with you today. And on behalf of all of our readers, thank you for your time, for sharing your wisdom, and for your service to the church.
Well, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.
United in spirit and prayer.